Bill Keating didn't just challenge Pete Hegseth. He cracked open the foundation of an entire national security agenda with one blistering statement that froze the room. Because the moment he began speaking, it became painfully clear that this wasn't oversight, wasn't routine questioning, and wasn't a polite exchange of ideas. This was a calculated unraveling of a message that had been repeated for months, and Keating delivered it with the kind of precision that leaves no air to breathe. And if you weren't paying attention before he started, by the time he finished, you realized something that many inside Washington whisper about quietly.
Security issue. And among that, I'm really worried about the agreement with El Salvador that exists. I think it's very cloudy. We don't know exactly what they're getting in return for their commitment to house the hellhole prisons. In the hellhole prisons they have, people that are shipped there, transported there illegally. But there's problems with that. It violates the Constitution, number one. It violates the First Step Act that President Trump paraded around and took so much credit for in his first term, he and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. It violates the Leahy Law, which prohibits federal money to be used for prisons of that type. It violates the Foreign Assistance and Transparency and Accountability Act that our Secretary of State was a proud sponsor of, that demands taxpayer accountability for monies, because all we know is the White House has said they've given El Salvador, given their strongman, Bukele, $6 million. But then they're holding another $15 million in international narcotics and control and law enforcement to the side for prospective use here. And of concern, too, is we're now transferring helicopters, military assets, to Bukele. We're giving him helicopters. And I'm concerned about that. Supposedly it's there for humanitarian reasons. It's being taken away from the Drug Control Task Force dealing with the fentanyl issue. And now it's there for humanitarian reasons in Bukele's control. And I'm just worried about going down the road here. I think there should be strict oversight of what they're getting from the U.S. If that's not there, and there's dark money and dark assets being passed, we could have the makings of another Iran-Contra. Thirdly, the third pillar, deterrence. And I look to what every expert militarily, from a security standpoint, said is the greatest deterrent that we have with China and Russia, and our greatest weakness if we lose it. And that's the war in Ukraine. If we fail to support Ukraine, and Ukraine loses, that's a green light for China. That's just not my opinion. That's virtually every security expert. We have something China and Russia don't have. We have a coalition of 50 countries, 50, dealing together. They don't have anything near that. Yet, you've attacked that alliance. You said they're pathetic. You called them freeloaders. They have paid, and we want more money, and they're giving more money for their own defense, but they've given $199 billion towards Ukraine, more than the U.S., by the way. And they're not freeloaders when they came to our assistance at 9/11. They suffered thousands of casualties, several hundred deaths. They're young men and women, sacrificed to defend Article 5, the only time it was exercised for the United States. They're not freeloaders. They're dealing with that. And yet today, you attacked one of them saying that now you've confirmed that the U.S. has plans in place to invade the territory of a founding member of NATO, Denmark. That's not being strong. That's not being strong. It's also chaotic. This is the chaos cabinet when it comes to Ukraine. Secretary of the Treasury, Putin is a war criminal. Trump's chief negotiator, Putin is trustworthy. He's not a bad guy. Secretary of State, Putin was a war criminal, I guess, but now he's not. He doesn't know. Trump says Ukraine was the aggressor. The Secretary of State says Russia was the aggressor. You, sir, the Secretary of Defense, said Russia was the aggressor. The chair of Joint Chiefs said yesterday that Putin would even stop at Ukraine. The Trump ambassador resigned because of this policy, and I think Vice President Vance said it best. He said he doesn't care what happens to Ukraine one way or the other. That is not strength. That is not using our coalition. That is not deterrence. You're wrong on all your pillars. I yield back.
Gentleman yields.
This so-called national security strategy is hanging together by tape, confusion, and political improvisation that he began by dismantling the very first pillar that Hegseth praised, restoring the warrior ethos. But Keating didn't approach it like a talking point. He approached it like someone who sat with the families of deployed soldiers, walked through makeshift combat hospitals, and watched elite operators plan missions that never make headlines. He didn't romanticize it. He's lived it. So when he heard claims that the warrior ethos needs to be restored, he didn't get angry. He got factual. He said the quiet part out loud. The ethos never left the troops. The only people who talk like it's gone are the ones too far away from the battlefield to understand the truth. The soldiers don't need motivational speeches about toughness. They need stability, clear guidance, and respect from the very leaders who claim to speak for them. And the way Keating framed it cut deeper than any insult. It wasn't a disagreement. It was a reminder that the people in uniform have been carrying the weight of geopolitical mistakes for decades, and they don't need political branding on top of it. But that was just the warm-up. The first crack in the pillars was symbolic. The second crack opened into something much darker, because the moment Keating shifted to border security, the tone changed. The room shifted, and the conversation stopped being theoretical. He brought up the secretive, barely understood deal with El Salvador, an arrangement that critics and analysts have worried about for months. The agreement involves transferring detainees to some of the harshest prisons in the Western Hemisphere, facilities known internationally for extreme conditions, human rights concerns, and a government that runs them with an iron grip. But the shocking part wasn't the existence of the prisons. It was the secrecy surrounding the terms. Who approved this? What was promised? What did El Salvador get in return? And what laws were bent, or broken, to push it through? Keating laid it out with chilling clarity. Constitutional violations, conflicts with federal statutes, direct clashes with the First Step Act. Even provisions in foreign assistance and transparency laws appear to have been sidestepped or ignored outright. And all the public was told is that $6 million was sent, and another $15 million is being quietly held aside. For what? No one can say. No documents. No transparency. No answers. Just a blank space where accountability should be. Then came the twist, the detail that cut through the noise like a blade. The United States isn't just sending money. It's sending helicopters, military equipment. Assets that used to support narcotics operations are now being placed in the hands of President Bukele, a leader who, depending on who you ask, is either a visionary or an authoritarian consolidating power faster than anyone expected. But Keating wasn't alarmist. He was factual. He pointed out that Bukele already controls the police, the military, and the courts. And now the U.S. is adding military equipment into that mix with minimal oversight. Rumors have already circulated among foreign policy analysts that this pattern, quiet transfers, minimal transparency, politically convenient partnerships, resembles the early signs of a historical scandal. Keating didn't say it had happened, but he warned, with that precise, razor-sharp tone, that if dark money or unaccounted for assets are circulating in this partnership, the U.S. could be witnessing the early architecture of another Iran-Contra-style disaster. Not a repeat, but the familiar outline of a problem that grows in the shadows until it explodes into the light. But if the first two pillars were cracks, the third was total collapse. Because when Keating spoke about deterrence, he moved from critique to reality check. Every major military strategist, across ideological lines, has said the same thing. The greatest deterrent to global authoritarian expansion right now is Ukraine. Not because it's symbolic, not because it's fashionable, but because Ukraine's resistance has tied down Russia's military, exposed their weaknesses, and stopped aggressive moves before they spread. That resistance is the single strongest signal to both Moscow and Beijing that expansion will be costly, and that democracies will stand together. And Keating reminded everyone that the U.S. has something Russia and China cannot manufacture: a coalition of 50 nations marching in lockstep to support Ukraine. 50. That's unprecedented in the modern era. That's deterrence. But instead of strengthening that alliance, certain members of the cabinet have spent months insulting, questioning, or dismissing those very allies, calling them freeloaders, saying they give nothing, claiming they don't contribute. Keating responded with a number that froze the air. Those allies have contributed $199 billion, more than the U.S. And they didn't do it out of charity. They did it because they stood with the United States when Article 5 was invoked after September 11th. Their soldiers died for America. Their troops shed blood for a fight that was not theirs. And now, when the U.S. needs coalition strength, dismissing these allies as unimportant isn't just ungrateful. It's strategically catastrophic. But the real chaos wasn't in the insults. It was in the contradictions. Over the past year, different leaders inside this national security circle have given completely opposite statements about core issues. One official says a major foreign leader is a war criminal. Another says he's misunderstood. Someone else calls Ukraine the aggressor. Someone else calls Russia the aggressor. Another says no one knows. Defense leaders contradict State Department leaders. Negotiators contradict cabinet members. And at least one top official resigned because he couldn't defend the policy anymore. Keating didn't have to exaggerate. He simply listed the contradictions one after another until the picture became unavoidable. This isn't a security team. It's a room full of people all reading different scripts, pulling in different directions, and contradicting one another in ways that confuse allies and embolden adversaries. When your message to the world becomes unpredictable, the world stops treating you as stable. And when stability collapses, deterrence collapses with it. Keating ended his takedown with a line that cut deeper than anything else. They are wrong on every pillar. Wrong on the military ethos. Wrong on border policy. Wrong on international alliances. Wrong on deterrence. Wrong on the messaging that shapes global power. Wrong in ways that create the conditions for crises they may not be prepared to manage. But here's the part no one says out loud. The warning behind the warning. If a cabinet presents itself as a unified strategic team, but internally operates like a storm of contradictions, the danger isn't just bad policy. The danger is unpredictability. Allies can't trust the plan. Adversaries test the boundaries. And history has shown, over and over, that global instability doesn't emerge overnight. It grows quietly through moments of mixed signals, political improvisation, and leadership that cannot decide where it stands. What Keating delivered wasn't a speech. It was a mirror held up to a team that may not realize how fractured it looks from the outside. And he left the audience with one question, one that lingers long after the hearing ends. Is this a national security strategy, or is this a slow-moving crisis unfolding in real time? If this breakdown helped you cut through the noise, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Do you think this team is capable of steering U.S. foreign policy? Or are we watching the early signs of something unraveling? More analysis coming soon.